Couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Just want to let you know we are recording this session. We also ask everyone to be on mute and suggest that you are in speaker view for the best viewing experience. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge and thank our sponsors, NFP Meltzer Group, Bender Family Foundation, Blake Real Estate, and Snyder Cohn, CPAs and trusted advisors. I also want to thank our Bagels and Business Committee, Sarit Arbel, Nathan Bortnick, Andy Chad, Brian Geister, Brad Lackey, Andy Stern, and Ian Weitz. Before we get started with our interview, it is my pleasure to introduce Josh Bender, the new CEO of the Bender JCC.
Thank you, Alana, and good morning to everybody. It's so wonderful to see so many people joining us for this great conversation this morning virtually. And I just wanted to say a few words before we get started this morning. The first thing I want to do is just thank Alana Fine and, of course, Rebecca Stallone, our co-chairs of Bagels and Business, and the entire committee for their creativity and their work through this peculiar year that we all find ourselves in keeping Bagels and Business relevant and continuing to bring this important program to so many people. The Bender JCC continues to serve the community on a very high level, and I think today's program is an illustration. It's my first Bagels and Business program, and it's just an example of how we continue to reach our community. We're open physically for our membership, our fitness center, and our school, and our pools, our outdoor pool that's heated during the winter. It's so amazing to see so many people coming to the building and participating in our community, but also reaching people virtually like this morning, and finding ways to connect people in a variety of ways. So I want to welcome everybody. I'm so excited to be part of this morning. And I also want to thank Brian. I imagine Brian is very, very busy nowadays, and we really appreciate his time this morning. I hope I have a chance to get to meet many of you very soon. And thank you for joining us for our program. Alana.
Thanks, Josh. Welcome again. We're very excited to have you at the Bender JCC. So moving to our program, while we would love to see you in person at JCC, we're pleased we can bring this program to you from the comfort of your home or office, and this morning without having to go out in the snow and ice. Following Brian's presentation and Q&A, we'll have an opportunity to network in small groups. We'll be putting you into breakout rooms to give you a chance to chat with other participants. If you're not interested in participating, please leave the meeting when the program ends. We'll wait about a minute, and for those who are still in the Zoom, we'll be sending you to the breakouts. Brian has agreed to briefly go in each breakout room for some additional conversation. So now let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce Brian Rosen, who's a Senior Vice President of Commercial Strategy and Public Policy at Novavax, with responsibility for leading commercial strategy efforts instrumental in ensuring patient access to Novavax vaccines. During the COVID-19 pandemic, he has served as the point person to lead negotiations with all relevant domestic and international government agencies and NGOs. Specifically, he led negotiations and secured a $1.6 billion funding agreement with Operation Warp Speed, $388 million in funding for the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and a $60 million agreement with the U.S. Department of Defense. And we'll talk about these later in our conversation. Brian initially joined Novavax in 2015 as Vice President of Market Access and Policy, and was named Vice President of Commercial Strategy in June 2018. He came to Novavax with more than 20 years of industry, legal, and patient advocacy experience, including government affairs, advocacy, reimbursement, and policy work. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, and nice to be here with you.
Yes, it's great to have you. Obviously, this is a very relevant topic, and I know everyone on the Zoom looks forward to the conversation. One thing I should have added is when we do get to the Q&A, everyone can put their questions in the chat, but we'll get to that later. So before we start talking about vaccines and Novavax, I'd like to talk a little bit about you. Can you tell us a little bit about your career path and how you landed in the biotech space, and then how your path evolved to your current position?
Sure. And thank you again for having me here today. Really appreciate it. So I have a very unconventional path. I started my career as a litigation attorney and somehow wound up at a vaccine company working in a pandemic. So that's a pretty circuitous route that I won't go into great detail, but from being a litigation attorney, I somehow broke into the pharmaceutical world in more policy and government relations roles, working in the areas of Medicare and Medicaid originally. Those policy issues sort of transcended into lots of different payer and reimbursement issues, meaning how do you get novel therapies? How do you get unique products, unique vaccines to the patients, to the people who need them? How do you overcome the obstacles, making sure that people aren't paying exorbitant co-pays or co-insurances, and that payers, both public and private, are actually reimbursing for those therapies. So a lot of that work, that access work, has sort of transcended throughout my career at different biotech companies. I spent about 10 years at a local company called MedImmune. Some people I'm sure know it. They were ultimately acquired by AstraZeneca. I also spent several years in the nonprofit sector at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, doing work that was really important, again, for making sure that patients who have blood cancers could, again, get the therapies they needed. And then ultimately worked my way back into the vaccine space here at Novavax. So long route, long circuitous route, but couldn't have envisioned it, but I'm happy to be part of this right now.
And so I know when we had talked a little bit, but a couple of weeks ago, we talked about, how, like you had just said, how your career path certainly didn't expect to kind of end up in this biotech space. So what advice would you give to professionals who might be on the Zoom who are interested in the mission purpose driven work of the field, but like you, don't have a science or research background?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would encourage any younger person, younger students to pursue STEM education. I think it is really important, and there's a great need in this county and in this state to have more professionals that are pursuing STEM education. But be that as may, there are people like me who didn't go that traditional STEM route and don't have the science background. But there are lots of roles in the biotech sector, I can say, for people like that, people with business backgrounds, policy backgrounds. There's at Novavax, we have policy, we have government relations. There's obviously sales and marketing roles, market access roles, business development, data analytics, IT roles. And then, of course, there's the whole manufacturing. There's how do you manufacture the product and how do you distribute the product and creating that supply chain. We have to get 1 billion doses out the door of this vaccine. And there are people who are focused on that entire supply chain. They don't necessarily have the traditional science, clinical scientist background. So lots of non-traditional roles to pursue as well.
But also, that's a great point as well, though, about just the importance of particularly in this county and for young people to think about STEM as a field as well. So speaking of Montgomery County, a lot of people don't realize is one of the largest biotech hubs in the country, especially around immunology, but often seems like the best kept secret. What have been the trends in the county over the last 15 years that have laid this foundation, and how has this ecosystem benefited Novavax?
Yeah, Novavax is very fortunate to be in Montgomery County. This is a lot of people don't realize that this county is actually one of the 5 biggest, strongest biotech hubs in the entire country. And start by saying we have all of these government resources, within 10-mile radius of us in terms of NIH and FDA and NIST. I mean, there's a tremendous, the access to those government groups is tremendously important for a company like Novavax. When I got here back in 2002, this was sort of early stage biotech. A lot of incubators, small 5 and 10 person groups. MedImmune that I was at the time was one of the largest groups, and it was still less than 1,000 people, so small by national pharmaceutical standards. But a lot of these small companies have had great success. I mentioned that MedImmune was acquired by AstraZeneca. You've got originally the Human Genome Sciences that was acquired by GSK, and now GSK has a large facility and space here in the county. You've got other successes, Glycomimetics, United Therapeutics, Emergent Biosolutions. The list goes on and on. These small companies have transcended. They've become bigger. They've become, their early clinical development has become late stage. Many of them have marketing success and partnerships with bigger companies now. So now you have this incredible talent pool in the county. And it's not just a biotech hub, it's actually a vaccine hub. Some of those companies that I mentioned are really important in the vaccine space. And by having this talent pool, I mean, that's just a resource that you can't overestimate for Novavax. We've grown from, in the last year, from a year ago at this time, from 150 people to over 700 people. And a lot of those people are local. That's the talent pool. So that's a huge access. We also have a state, a county, and a city of Gaithersburg here that are extremely supportive of the biotech community. So that's allowed us to lease more additional space, acquire more property. And so all of these resources, and I'm probably not mentioning half of them, have just been really important for a company like Novavax.
Well, I know that the county is very happy to have you here and have you growing. So set the stage for us a little bit now, if we can rewind. What was the state of vaccine innovation and technology last January and February, which obviously seems like a lifetime ago, but as the coronavirus started to spread, and what does it? I'm sorry, I'll let you answer. Then I have a last follow up.
Yeah, no, so I remember the day. We had just gotten back from winter vacation, and it was January 3rd, and a year ago, January 3rd, and I was sitting in my office, and Dr. Gail Smith, who's kind of our lead researcher here, and brilliant scientist, and discovered all these different vaccines and platforms, including our own, comes into my office and says, "We've got a really bad-looking virus in Wuhan, China, and we're going to have to start making a vaccine for this." And I just kind of looked at him like, "Oh, okay, Gail, whatever you're working on, great. I'm glad you're doing something important here, but I've got to focus on today." Wasn't really thinking about what the impact of this new virus was going to be. But then then in the next 10 days or so, we realized what we had at our disposal at Novavax. We realized, here's a company that we've been working on this platform technology for years and years, and getting it better and better. And I can talk briefly about the technology if you like, but we had reached a point with this technology where we knew that we could make a coronavirus vaccine. We had made other coronavirus vaccines, MERS and SARS. We were on the heels of a phase 3 result for our influenza vaccine that came just a couple of months later. And so we had this experience, we had this ability to quickly make vaccines for very similar looking pathogens. And so we knew this was sort of a perfect storm for Novavax, where we could do this quickly. So I'll stop there, but that's where we were back in January of last year.
Yeah, I will. So that was going to be my follow-up, is that if you don't mind getting in just a little bit in this and talk about what you mean by a vaccine platform. And I ask that because I think all of us have become armchair, immunologists, epidemiologists, and scientists as we've been reading everything we can about the vaccines and the coronavirus. So if you could explain it for us, I think it'd be helpful about vaccine platform.
So first of all, I'm definitely not a scientist and I'm definitely not a physician, but I'll give you my version and of what we're doing here. So we do have this platform technology, and we call it it's known as a recombinant nanoparticle protein technology. So what does all that mean? We have two components to our vaccine. We have this protein, this nanoparticle protein, and then we have an adjuvant known as matrix M. That's a novel adjuvant. So let me just tell you quickly what that means. So the protein first, right? So we were able to, back in January, get the genetic sequence for this virus. And by getting the genetic sequence, we can then encode or include the relevant portion of the protein, okay? And so you hear in the news a lot about the spike protein. So that's what we're talking about, right? We were able to get the sequence and encode the relevant portion of that spike protein. And then for us, it's the entire spike protein. Those genes then, those proteins are then cloned onto an insect cell line. That's actually where we grow this protein, on an insect cell line. It's like an armyworm, actually. So the proteins then, they fold, and it's pretty amazing what happens on this insect cell line. They fold into their native conformational state, and then they're ultimately expressed and purified as these nanoparticles. I wish I had a picture of what those nanoparticles look like. It's pretty amazing. But those nanoparticles, when they react with the virus, create a highly immunogenic response. So that's good on its own. The second part of the vaccine is this matrix M technology. And when I tell you what that is, you'd be like, how did you ever figure out where that comes from? So matrix M comes from a special tree that's grown in Chile. All right. So what happens is the saponin is actually extracted from the tree bark of that tree in Chile. It's then turned into a powder. They call it a lyophilization. It's then mixed with different cholesterols and phospholipids. And so it's a process. And until you get this sticky matrix M adjuvant, that matrix M has this effect of creating an even higher immunogenic response and a dose sparing effect, so that we can use very little of the protein in each dose of the vaccine. And that's what we're doing. We're actually only using 5 micrograms of the protein that I talked about earlier. You mix it with this adjuvant and put it in the vial, and you've got this vaccine. So I know it's a little confusing, but it's a pretty incredible process. And again, a lot of that goes to the scientists here under Gail Smith, who I mentioned earlier, to figure out how that works, and how it works not just against COVID, but against many of these different pathogens.
Well, you might be getting a lot of requests to come talk to kids' science classes to explain that.
Yeah.
So thank you. I think just understanding a little bit of the complexity of the technology is important for us all. So so now kind of thinking of like going back to where you were in January and February. So how did you then, when you're realizing that you had this platform to potentially quickly develop a vaccine, and there started to be more and more conversation that we thought that we would be able to, as a country, develop these vaccines quickly. How did Novavax get involved in Operation Warp Speed? Maybe talk a little bit about specifically what it is, and what did it mean? What did it mean for the company?
Right, and this is where I'm a little bit on safer ground.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we had some early great animal data, right? We saw what this vaccine could do in animals, and we were fortunate to partner early on with CEPI. CEPI is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. They are a nonprofit group that's out of I think they're based out of Europe, and they fund different innovative products in these kinds of situations. They started with a small funding, and then they saw our early animal data, and by late April, early May, they were in. They were in for $400 million, which for a group like CEPI was by far and away the biggest investment they had made. And they were funding our early clinical development. They said, we want you to do phase 1 and phase 2. We also want to fund some early manufacturing so that you can start to process and scale up your ability to produce this vaccine. And that was critical. That gave us, and now also at the same time, we got our flu data, our influenza phase 3 flu data. So now we had a little bit of credibility on this, and people realized this is a platform that could actually work for COVID. From there, it was the Department of Defense who called and said, we know something about your technology. We want to talk more. And several weeks later, we had their $60 million contract to acquire 10 million doses of whatever that finished product ultimately looked like. Well, Department of Defense turned out to be part of Operation Warp Speed, along with a group called BARDA, which is part of Health and Human Services, and the CDC and several other NIH. All these groups came together to create Operation Warp Speed. And so you had some people at Operation Warp Speed who now knew about Novavax and knew what we were doing. And before long, we had this incredible agreement to fund all of the later stage clinical development, the phase 3 work, plus really scaling up the manufacturing in the US. And so that gave us an ability to, it gave us a runway. It gave us a financial runway and the ability to move fast. We could not have done this in nearly the time that we've done it in without the backing and the partnering of all of those groups. It also just gave us the ability, these different agreements to scale up. And now we have manufacturing sites in 8 different sites in 7 different countries where we're producing different components of the vaccine. And of course, we have our phase 3 results that from that funding. We have these phase 3 results that were just announced a couple of weeks ago out of the UK that we can get into. But that was a huge success for us, and really the culmination of all those different partnerships.
Yeah, so you teed up my next question. So you just a couple of weeks ago, I know you were teasing with me that, depending on the results, we may or may not want you to stay as a speaker, but here you are. A couple of weeks ago, Novavax did release the results from the late stage clinical trial, as you just alluded. Can you tell us a little bit more about the results, what it means for the vaccine, and then what it means for availability here in the US?
Yeah. Okay. So again, the results we announced, one was a phase 3 pivotal trial with 15,000 subjects in the UK. And this was successful on so many levels. We had 96% efficacy against the original Wuhan strain. And so that's the apples to apples comparison, because you had heard earlier, Moderna and Pfizer with their phase 3 results, there's the apples to apples, because that's the same strain. We had 89% even overall efficacy, and that's considering that half the subjects actually did not have the original Wuhan strain. They actually had a UK variant. So the virus has mutated in the UK, but we still had excellent results, even considering that there was a variant circulating. And then at the same time, we announced the phase 2B results from South Africa. Those are even more interesting results. And it's not as big a trial. It was about 4,000 subjects. But in the South Africa, 90% of the people had a variant that is particularly concerning, this variant. This is what they call the triple mutant variant, meaning it's 3 steps removed from the original Wuhan strain. It really doesn't look so similar anymore to the Wuhan strain. And that's a little bit scary for the public, but we still showed 60% efficacy against that Wuhan strain in people most people who did not have HIV. So the HIV negative population. That was a really important result. It said that our vaccine can cross protect. we can cross protect against these different mutations. Obviously, 60% is not as good as the 96%. And so there's a need for Novavax and other vaccine manufacturers to now put a new strain into their vaccine, whether that's a booster strategy or what we call a bivalent strategy, putting at least 2 different strains into our vaccine. And that's going to be necessary. But to show the cross protection and that you could still elicit a good efficacy result where there's this triple mutant variant strain was very important for the organization and for global public health as well.
And so I know that everyone probably has a similar question about, so you tested it in the UK. Does that mean now you need to test it here in the US before it can be receive authorization?
So that's still a little bit unclear. 2 parts to that answer. One is we are doing a phase 3 trial in the US. We're well into that trial. Enrollment has been going very well. We're almost fully enrolled. And that's a 30,000 person trial. So it's twice as big as the UK trial, and 2/3 of the patients are getting vaccine, 1/3 is getting placebo. So lots of vaccinations taking place. And that'll be an important result as well. I'm not exactly sure when we'll have the results from that trial. And I'm not exactly sure whether we'll need to wait for the results for that trial for an FDA review of our vaccine. It's just unclear at this point. They haven't opined yet as to whether they're going to need the US trial results in order to provide an authorization for our vaccine. So that's the status. That's the status there.
So thank you. I know we'll all be kind of watching for those developments. But kind of switching over a little bit to the business of vaccines. So we've heard a lot about the deals that the US and other countries are making with various vaccine companies to purchase vaccine. Can you kind of walk us through the ecosystem? Like, what is the symphony that has to happen to go from a trial to the full-blown manufacturing? Kind of as you were talking about different job opportunities in this space. So think about all those things that go in, particularly the logistics and manufacturing. We're all kind of learning a little bit about it on our own. But if you could walk us through the real deal on it.
Yeah, there's so much going on. So on one part of the answer is, what's going on all these purchasing agreements and things. There is an ecosystem. There are lots of countries like the US that are purchasing vaccine as bilateral deals, bilateral agreements with the different developers, including Novavax. And you can understand why countries are trying to secure enough vaccine for their own populations, and also procuring multiple technologies to hedge their bets, so to speak, to make sure that they've got different shots on goal and make sure that they've got lots of opportunities to vaccinate their populations. Then you have a group like the COVAX facility. The COVAX facility is kind of like a big buying group. They were stood up. This COVAX group was created by CEPI, the group that funded us early, and WHO, UNICEF, the Gates Foundation, and others as well, Gavi. And it's like a buying group where manufacturers like Novavax provide vaccine to the COVAX facility. We sell vaccine to the COVAX facility, and countries have an opportunity to buy vaccine through the COVAX facility. So maybe there are countries who can't get a bilateral deal and don't have the resources to secure a bilateral deal with a developer directly. They can get their vaccine directly through this buying group, this COVAX facility. And that's great for all the countries, but especially for some of these lower and middle income countries throughout the globe, so that they can have access to the different vaccines as well. So that's a really important resource. The other part of this is the timing of the manufacturing, and how do you get from trials to manufacturing, you were asking about. So normally, we would spend years on the trials. You'd go through the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, not to mention the early research. And then you would start to scale up your manufacturing after you saw your later stage results, so that you've got a good vaccine, and then you start to scale it up because it's very expensive and time consuming to create those manufacturing resources. But here, everything's been done in parallel, and that's where we've really taken months and years off of the clock, and we've been able to speed up these timelines. So it's not that steps were skipped. It's not that there's been shortcuts. It's just that things have been done in parallel. And that's really important. And that means that people did these things at risk. Novavax took risk. The government, the U.S. government took risk. CEPI took risk. But you had to do it during a pandemic, do these things in parallel to ensure that we had vaccine in a as timely a manner as possible.
And so, you mentioned risks, and, for a lot of businesses, you're taking risks because of the payoff in the return. So can you talk a little bit about the business model for Novavax behind vaccine development? You mentioned you'd already had the flu vaccine in development and had strong results there. So what will a successful vaccine mean for Novavax now and in the future?
Yeah, it's huge for our organization. I mean, it's great. I'm very proud that this company is part of this pandemic solution, and that we have what appears to be a very successful, important arrow in the quiver to address this pandemic. But it's also a validation of our company and our technology, and that coupled with the phase 3 flu result, it really demonstrates that this platform can work against multiple different pathogens. So we're excited. I mean, I mentioned earlier, we're expanding. We've grown to over 700 people now, and I'm sure we'll be well over 1,000 in no time at all. We've leased new space in Gaithersburg. We've brought some additional property. We're hiring like crazy now. I mean, and they're all virtual. So I haven't met
who works for you.
3/4 of our organization. But I've seen them on cameras like this. And for me personally, it's an opportunity. We're building a commercial organization now. So now we can actually think about what life looks like after an FDA authorization, not just for COVID, but for future pathogens. And we can have a commercial organization that can think about how do we ensure that these vaccines reach the population. And so it's an incredible opportunity for our organization.
And do you think, kind of looking ahead, that what will be the change in how we think about our vaccines and the brands associated? This seems to me like a real sea change in how we think about something that is really something you don't think about the brand. You get your flu shot, it's not a brand, but because of all the press now, Pfizer, Moderna, Novavax, AstraZeneca, they're all become these household names. So when I go now for my next flu shot, or hopefully when I go to get the vaccine, do you just see this different phase of branding around things that kind of used to not have a brand associated with them?
Yeah, we definitely have a more educated population now on
for better
vaccines.
or worse. Yeah,
and that's no. I think it's actually a really good thing that people are informed and they know about their different options. Look, during a pandemic, let's get as many vaccines out there as possible. We've got 15 billion people on this planet. We've got 350 million people in this country. We need a lot of vaccine, and you've seen it hasn't gone as smoothly as we would like it to in terms of the rollout. So we need a lot of vaccine right now. But to your point, for the future, people are going to know. People are going to, and they should. What are the differentiators among the different vaccines? What does the efficacy look like? What does the long-term safety look like? How long is the durability of protection? What is the distribution, and how easy are these vaccines to administer? Can they be stored in cold temperatures, or do they have to be frozen? These are different differentiators among the vaccines. And so ultimately, and I don't know whether it's 2 years from now or 5 years from now, I do think that certain vaccines will have more of a broader use in the markets than others. I just think that's inevitable. But for today, they're all good options. If they're approved by the FDA or by another regulatory authority in a different country, then people should feel good that they are safe and effective and they can be used, and they should be used.
And so let me actually, I'll use that as my last question before I turn to some of the questions from the audience. But you talked about how there's just such a huge need for vaccines, and that right now, obviously, we see much more demand than supply. How do you see in the next couple of years it playing out, where like you alluded to, there's a more educated public than before on vaccines, and so many different companies kind of in this race, which is kind of, we all feel like we're all winners for the more companies that have an effective vaccine. But as you look ahead, how do you see that race kind of playing out? When do you see it ending up with only 2 or 3 vaccines, or just there will always be this huge supply, and there'll continue to be the mutations that require multiple vaccines?
Well, if I knew the answer to this question, I could really parlay that. But no, sorry, thought my phone was off. I would say that the one, I do think that ultimately, and I don't know whether it's 2 years from now or beyond, that there will be less vaccines on the marketplace. I think the cream will rise to the top in terms of the products with the greatest advantages, efficacy, safety, and so forth. But I also think that there are new wrinkles that we keep seeing every day. And so these new variants tell me and tell the vaccinologists and the epidemiologists that COVID's going to be here for a while. And these mutations that are coming mean that we will need to adapt the vaccines. And it may look a lot like flu, where the vaccine is an annual vaccine, for example, and that instead of a single strain, you have a bivalent or trivalent or quadrivalent vaccine. But I think that we are going to have to adapt to what we're seeing in the environment and create these new vaccines, and that means that we need to be careful. So I wouldn't want to get too far ahead of myself to say, well, this is going to look exactly like flu in a few years, and there'll only be a few vaccines. I think the message really needs to be right now is let's continue developing. Let's keep investing in the companies with next generation even of vaccines, and make sure that there are a lot of shots on goal right now.
Yeah. That makes sense. I guess we've all learned from this year that we should not try to predict the future at all. So I want to turn over to some questions from the audience, but first want to answer 2 questions. One, Brian cannot help you figure out where to get a vaccine right now. And 2, your registration for the event does not come with a free vaccine today either, unfortunately. But we did get a question. We'll start here. You had mentioned that you were phase 3 trials here in the U.S. How can people enroll in that trial? Are you looking for any specific demographic group? And is the trial being held here in Montgomery County?
So the last part of that question, I know there are 2 trial sites in Maryland. One is with the University of Maryland, and I think the other one might be in Howard County. I'm not exactly sure. As I said, we're getting close to the enrollment numbers, the 30,000 subject number. So it's getting a little bit late. But I would suggest to go on our website. I know there's a link for the phase 3 trial. So Novavax.com. I'm sure that can get you to the trial site as well. And in terms of, I think you asked about the different type of enrollment. We've been really in a good place with our trial to make sure that there's lots of representation in the trial. Older adults, Hispanic population, African-American population, Native American population, others as well. So it's been very rewarding in terms of seeing really the inclusion in this trial.
Yeah, particularly because I imagine for you've talked a lot about how just access and advocacy have been a big part of your career. Right. So right. I can see how that'd be rewarding. So at Bagels and Business, we often try to also talk about like management and leadership challenges. someone had put a question in here kind of about what do you see, what's your most significant challenge as an employer? I imagine kind of in this period of time, well, in general, but also in this period of, I imagine, incredible stress, but also just incredible, workload.
Yeah, and it is a big issue. There are people like me who've been here for a long time, but especially in this past year, it has been nonstop. It's been working, 14-hour days regularly, but I think there's been a real sense of purpose and mission, and I don't see people tiring from that mission. I think people they're driven because they're seeing what we can contribute to this, and so look, we need to continue hiring. We need to bring in resources so that we can spread the work around a little bit. But every time you bring someone in, that you have to train and make sure that they understand all the protocols and so forth. So, from a leadership standpoint, it's definitely a challenge, but thank goodness we have this sense of purpose, and everyone's kind of rallying. And then you see a phase 3 result like we saw in the UK, and it sort of re-energizes everyone.
Yeah, I'm sure. You had talked about your growth in Montgomery County, and so there's a question about, are you just how your continued, I guess, your current growth plans for here in the county and other. And are your current growth plans here in the county? And then just kind of a question about how it has been to navigate doing business here in Montgomery County.
Yeah, I mean, I touched on this a bit earlier that, we have lots of growth plans, especially in Montgomery County, especially in Gaithersburg, and we'll hopefully have more of a more properties, more office space that we acquire to accommodate what I imagine is going to be a much bigger employee population. And we have growth also outside of Montgomery County. I mean, we actually acquired a manufacturing facility. It's one of the largest manufacturing facilities in the world, in the Czech Republic, outside of Prague. And this used to be a site of Serum Institute, who's maybe the largest vaccine developer in the world, out of India. They own this site in Czech Republic. We acquired it from them, and it gave us access to these enormous 6,000 liter scale bioreactors to produce, upwards of a billion doses a year eventually out of that facility. So, and that of course means hiring a lot of people in the Czech Republic as well. So, yeah, it's great. And Montgomery County, the doing business here. I mentioned, all of the different resources, the government, for sure, having access to FDA. I mean, our phase 3 trial, one of the reasons it's so successful is by working with the US government, Operation Warp Speed, but NIH also, in terms of, having the trial sites and having them work with us on the different trial sites. So again, it's really important that we're right here in Montgomery.
Well, you also just got the attention of all the commercial real estate developers who are probably on the line. So a couple quick questions, and then I'm going to move us to networking, but these are kind of all related to the specifics on your vaccine. So couple things. Number one is, how many do you anticipate being available, depending on when you get approval, as far as over what time frame would they be distributed to the public? Is the vaccine one shot or two? Yeah, I think those are the quick questions.
Yeah, so it's a 2-shot regimen, and we get some level of immunogenicity and protection after 1 shot, but you really get an incredible boost with the 2nd shot, and those are about 21 to 28 days apart. Just like the others that you've seen on the market so far. So our agreement with Operation Warp Speed includes the delivery of 100 million doses plus another 10 million doses through the Department of Defense. I imagine that there will be an opportunity to both produce, but also to distribute more vaccine as we get further down this timeline. But there will be, suffice it to say, hundreds of millions of doses coming from Novavax to the U.S. population in 21 and into 2022.
Got it. And one last question, because I know a lot of people have this question, and it affects many. Have your trials included those with cancer?
I want to say yes, but I'm not. I just not sure of that answer, so I'll hold off, and I can get you an answer offline. Okay,
great. Well, Brian, thank you so much. This has been incredibly informative and for everyone, and I think also piqued kind of the interest in the audience to be tracking Novavax over the next couple of weeks and months. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So before we go to our breakouts, I did just want to thank everyone for joining us. And once again, a big thank you to Brian for spending time with us during a very, very busy day, probably. Following today's program, you will receive a survey. We do ask you to take a moment to complete it, as it really does help us with future programming. And we do hope you join us for a brief networking opportunity. Just stay on the Zoom, and we'll put everyone in breakout rooms. So thank you very much.